My name is Matt Wilhelmy, and I'm the owner of Strategic Voyages Business Consultants. I'm also the author of Taboo Business Questions, What's Haunting Every Entrepreneur's Growth. And today I am joined by a wonderful guest who is joining me from over the pond in the UK. Her name is Amy Wilson. She's a Fractional Chief Marketing Officer. She's got over 10 years of experience leading performance marketing initiatives on a global scale. Often she's brought in to work with first-time founders. She's brought in by the investors in those companies. Sometimes, those marketing companies aren't doing a great job and they need some strategic advice, and Amy is the one to answer the call. It's important to note that she's not, she's sector agnostic, but she does have immense knowledge base in FinTech and B2B sales, which I think is going to lead very nicely into today's conversation. But without further ado, Amy, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. It's the afternoon here, morning for you, so I'm having my afternoon cup of tea. It's a pleasure to chat today.
Yeah, so Amy, you and I were kind of talking a little bit, before we started recording about some of your, the different experiences you've had, some of the projects you've worked on. Today's case study, we are going to talk about an EdTech company. And so I'm just kind of curious, when you're kind of thinking through some of the projects that you've had, is there one or two that maybe really line up to working with these types of companies and solving some of their issues?
Yeah, I've worked on a few EdTech companies in my career. In fact, one that I worked on so long ago, it was one of the first apps, and Apple didn't yet have category for education in the App Store. And I've also worked on specialist recruitment marketing for universities here in the UK. And I think that's really important to note, because the challenge I think about education marketing is that somewhere along the line you go from targeting the parents as decision makers into targeting the actual students themselves. And sometimes there'll be an overlap where you're targeting both. So for me, it's a really fascinating sector to work in.
Yeah, so you mentioned there's this dual marketing strategy, right? You got to target the parents, you got to target maybe the users. What about the actual decision makers at the university, right? I mean, I'm sure at some point we have to target them too.
Yeah, and absolutely. When I was doing education marketing, we'd be dealing with them all the time, and we would be selling other things for them, like software and different systems to upgrade different types of backend for their website, all sorts of things. So there's a whole piece of analysis you would want to do at the beginning of any project to try and work out the personas of all your different stakeholders, whether that be the children, the parents, potentially even like nannies and tutors, and then the decision makers within the educational institutions themselves.
Yeah, that's that really kind of lines up here for the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, maybe some of those common issues that you're, brought into an organization to try and solve. I would imagine that, being a fractional chief marketing officer, sometimes they're just, the companies aren't getting a really good ROI on their media spend, right? And so the investors are looking at some of those numbers. Could be cost of acquisition, it could be, lifetime value of the client, and they're just not getting some of those results that they want. And so they bring you in, right? And they ask you to help solve some of these problems. What are, any of the other common issues that maybe you see when you're brought in?
Well, the most common issue I honestly see is one that actually feeds into all these other things. And it's one where, for whatever reason, a founder or investors have decided to make their first marketing hire in the organization. And instead of bringing in someone who's got a lot of experience, quite often I see scenarios where the decision is made to bring in someone with 1 or 2 years experience. And potentially, the attraction of that is that it's a cost-saving initiative on the cost of bringing that person in and cost of employing that person. But every time I've ever been brought in by investors or founders to fix that scenario, it's because too much responsibility has been given to someone who's a cost-effective hire, but they don't have the experience, they don't have the kind of depth of knowledge, sometimes they don't have the emotional development to stand up to the kind of difficult decision-making processes that happen within businesses. And nearly always that decision to bring in someone very junior as a cost-saving initiative on their salary ends up being much more expensive in the long run because of missed opportunities and in the worst cases, when things actually go wrong. So when you think about that in terms of managing the optimal relationship with the marketing supplier, like an agency, like a performance marketing agency. I've seen all sorts of things, right? Of course, I've seen things where the performance marketing agency are doing a bit of a joke because they don't realize that, but they think that someone's not looking up over their shoulder, like whether it's a founder or whether it's a junior person. But I've also seen the opposite, where a business has hired a really great conscientious marketing advisor or marketing agency, but sort of simply expecting them to exist in a vacuum and get everything done without any sort of symbiotic relationship. So that can also cause those marketing agencies not be able to deliver as effectively as they could otherwise if they were having those conversations and support from the founders or the junior marketing team.
Yeah, and so the value of working with somebody like yourself, right, as a fractional chief marketing officer, is they don't need to pay you a full-time salary. They could bring you in for a project, or maybe a few hours here and there to kind of fix some of the things that are going on, and maybe it's a lot more cost effective for them because they're able to use you as needed, and there's not this humongous long-term commitment that maybe a full-time employee has. And so, I'm curious, Amy, as we're going to jump in here in a minute to this case study about EdTech, one of the EdTech companies that I've worked with. There's probably a number of different revenue models that these different tech companies have, whether it's a monthly recurring revenue or an annual, recurring cost or something like that. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is the pricing structure, but we're only going to spend a minute or so on that. You're obviously the marketing expert here. And so I'm curious if you've seen this like huge difference in pricing structure. I'm just curious.
I mean, that's a massively open question. And I think it really depends on what you're selling. You might have an educational app that's direct to the parent. I've got a few for my children, but then you might also have the ones that the schools have, and then we have to have the logins that the schools are paying. And I think, if you're targeting a parent directly, it's likely going to be quite a low cost to get them on the platform, whereas educational institutions might be willing to pay more, or certainly by the time you're operating at the volumes that you are. For example, my son's school has 800 children, so that's a great relationship with them if they can have one or two conversations and get the whole school going through the system. But that's something as a marketer that you have to really adequately scope at the beginning. And I think this is where account-based marketing comes from, is that part of B2B is that you have these hero clients that are going to be game-changing for your business, and you might sit down with the founding team and identify who those founding clients are and specific tactical marketing initiatives to reach them. The great thing I've always said about B2B is that you can nearly always identify every single person that you want to sell to, or not necessarily the person, but the business. And usually in this day and age, you can identify, once you've got the business, you can have a good educated guess about who it is you might need to reach out to. So if there are those really, really big prestigious, educational institutions that perhaps you could release a PR release about when you sign them as a client, or they're just like huge institutions that have loads of students that are going to make a lot of revenue for you, you can sit down and pick 5 to 10 of those per year and have a specific account-based marketing strategy for those. But in the background, you can also run sort of other tactics to generate inbound leads from a wider range of organizations.
Wow. So you're able to kind of help them develop a proactive, directed marketing strategy, as well as kind of a more broad strategy that kind of attracts people to the organization, right?
I would always tend to recommend that. Obviously, it can differ on a case-by-case basis, but particularly if you're working with an investor-backed business, sometimes initiatives that takes a bit of time, but maybe not a lot of media, that's the low-hanging fruit for you as a founder, because if you can close 1 or 2 institutions through your hard work or your investors network or your family's network or your friends network, those are always really useful to have, because once you start getting that traction, it makes all the following conversations about investment easier. It also makes the conversations with future prospects easier, because you can come along and say, well, Harvard's already on board, Cambridge is already on board, and those are the conversations that make things easier as you grow as a business.
I think that we'd all like to have the ability to say that maybe Harvard is one of our clients, and that's why, another company should join. So that would be a wonderful thing to be able to say. But unfortunately, with this EdTech company we're about to get into, Harvard is not one of their clients yet. I bet they wish that it was. But I want to give our viewers just a quick background on this case study because I think it's important to set the stage. And it's also important to remind people that I'm typically brought into these different companies from a financial perspective to solve financial problems. And as a CFO, a fractional CFO, more often than not, I uncover a lot of marketing issues. The metrics aren't correct, or if there are even metrics at all. And it puts me in a really interesting spot, Amy, because I don't want to be their marketing expert. I'm supposed to be there to, look over the reports and kind of make sure that the financial function of the business is sound. But with this particular company, I was brought in as a fractional CFO. And over the course of about a year engagement with them, I noticed they had some pretty stinky marketing, if I could just use that term for a minute. That's an industry term, by the way. But specifically, they were having a hard time, kind of getting new clients. They had certainly gotten a few. Between you and me, I kind of think they lucked into these sales. They weren't resulting from a marketing campaign. It was really the founder of the company had some friends that he called and they signed up. But specifically what the EdTech company does, they sell their software to universities, and it's sold as a per course basis. And so they do charge an upfront fee kind of to get the syllabus into their database and kind of manipulate it around so they can add some gamification functions to the user experience. And they also charge a monthly fee of $25 per user per class. And so what they were finding, though, like I mentioned, is it was difficult for them to find more universities to want to use them. They had a handful, kind of refer to them from the founder. And I'm hoping that maybe today, Amy, when we're talking about this, that you can help me kind of identify some of the other issues that they're probably dealing with, as well as eventually we'll get into some of those solutions for the issues in a later episode. And so, what would be your approach, Amy, if you were brought in as a fractional marketing officer to work with this company? What would be maybe your first approach? What would be some of the things that you'd want to know?
I think, the first thing to say whenever you join a company as any kind of consultant or fractional is the most important thing is to have an eye on the long game and how you're going to impact on the team that you're going to end up managing. Because the worst possible thing you can do is come in and throw your weight around and rustle lots of feathers, because ultimately you need the team to buy into you. You need them to respect you so that you can deliver, what the company founders need. And you don't just command respect, you have to earn it. And the first impression with everyone in the team and all the other stakeholders in the C-suite, for example, you can't really get that wrong. And the part of that is treading carefully. I like to try and spend 2 to 4 weeks kind of like assimilating in the company. By that, I mean, I'll take the time to have one-to-ones with everybody that I'm going to be working with. And then I will join the cadences of the regular meetings. So the management meeting, if they have sprints, for example, daily, if there's a specific marketing meeting, or if there are any regular meetings with the agencies, things like that. And the most insightful part for me, and I probably shouldn't give this away because it's part of my trade, but when you have the one-to-ones with everyone, that's the most important part, because people, firstly, they'll speak freely. And secondly, you're looking for the inconsistencies between what different people feed back, because that's where you're going to need to laser focus your attention. That's where the things that are going wrong in the organization are going to be coming from. So for me, the fact finding and the simulation is going to help you figure out, who's going to be your ally, who's going to be difficult to manage, who needs to be managed out, who needs to be replaced. And those are all the critical decisions, because it's people that are going to be doing the work for you. And so getting that part right is absolutely crucial. And if you don't get that part right, then you haven't got a part after that part. So once you've got the information, it's then about, I'm very lucky. Like, I've always just been able to go into companies and not really worry about what decisions I'm making. I just can't explain it. I just go in, and as soon as people brief me or talk to me, the ideas are just going in my brain, and I'm very decisive. I cannot explain that. I've never been able to explain that. But it doesn't really matter what I decide, because it's not my company. So the next phase for me is to sit with the founders and whoever my senior stakeholders are, present them with perhaps my recommended list of priorities. But that's not set in stone. That's collaborative, and there may be other things happening in the business that I'm not aware of. So, depending on the size of the company and the size of the team and the personalities of the founder, sometimes I'll go in with 3 recommendations, sometimes I'll go in with 15, and sometimes, they want the whole management consultancy 100-page of things they'll never read. So I always try and find out from the founder what they're kind of expecting, and we go through that list. And that is really important because, like I say, it's not just about me. I can stress what I think is going to make the most difference, but the actions around those decisions are going to be made, and they're going to be decided together. And then the next thing, I suppose, is that we're not going to implement 30 things at once. Maybe it sounds really obvious, but with marketing, you get a halo effect. So many people would like to argue till they're blue in the face that with technology today, you can track absolutely everything, but that's just simply not true. So the halo effect, by that I mean, for example, you weren't running paid search, and then you run paid search, but your overall metrics got 40%, but only 20% is attributed to paid search. That's the halo effect. That's, it's not precise, but it's telling you that perhaps by launching paid search, there's been a 20% uplift on brand. So for me, that's why you wouldn't implement 20 things at once. You're going to try and implement things over a period of time, over a cadence, so you can start to see what's really having an effect. So once we agree the priorities, we would then put together a sort of like a Gantt chart of what we're going to implement and when, and you can factor in things like team holiday and seasonality and budgets and things like that. But that's the beginning part of my process.
Yeah, we'll have to dive into maybe those solutions in our 3rd episode, because on this particular episode, I really want to make sure that we're identifying the issues that this company is facing. I mean, for me, the big one was that they had 3 people they were paying a salary to that were supposed to be doing marketing that could not show me any reports. And so just from like the get-go, I just, again, I'm not the marketing expert, but I assume that if you are paying somebody a full-time salary and they don't have any marketing reports at all, that something is totally wrong. What would be some other things that maybe you'd want to know if you were, working with this company and trying to kind of understand the root cause of maybe their issues? Obviously not having reports is a big problem, but let's say we solve that. Okay, that's fine. That's not the end of the world, but what would be kind of maybe some of the other concerns that you'd have talking to this company?
Well, reports is actually a really interesting one, and I'm really, really glad that you have mentioned that, because as someone who cut my teeth doing paid search, there's this kind of joke amongst those of us that are really kind of geeky and into the paid search world that, we're happiest when we're like in a dark room with a search account and we're not doing anything else, right? And that joke kind of extends when you think about the way agencies operate and the way that clients can sometimes be their own worst enemies. And there's been a number of times, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. There's been a number of times where I've been pulled into big network agencies to try and fix broken client team relationships. And when I say that clients are their own worst enemies, the specific scenario I mean is when the client wants you on a call for every single hour of the day, or the client wants you to write a 30-page document, or the client wants you to come into a meeting with, present some document they just asked for. And the reason that's them acting in their own worst interest is because the more they want your face time and the more they want reports, they're eating into their retained resource, and you're not actually spending time on the things that are going to be the value add, that are going to make the accounts perform better and going to improve your ROI. And I've literally been pulled into huge projects where I audited an agency that was being paid £15,000 a month, and I looked into the change log and they hadn't made any changes to the Google ads for over 45 days. So that, that shows the kind of things we're dealing with, and especially when we think about younger team members, if they've got a very senior contact client side that's asking them, come to this meeting, do this report, they're scared to sort of say no, right? So this is why clients can act in their own worst interest. And I've even been involved in project teams where we've inside agencies where we brainstormed this idea that you have a stealth team in the background that actually the client doesn't even know about, so that they can just get on and do the work while the other team members are going to all the meetings. But this is the reality of how clients can end up creating a scenario where they're not getting what they need. So the reporting is really, really interesting. And I mean, reporting's obviously moved on a lot in the time that I've been working in digital marketing. And it used to be, literally used to be people paid to copy and paste things into Excel 24 hours a day. And obviously now there's lots more technology that's available, and the only way I would now condone any kind of level of like daily reporting or weekly reporting is if it had been built using scripts and things like that, or it's in a system, a BI system that's automating it. Because as soon as you've got your team spending more than like an hour a day on making reports, it's time that they could have been doing something that adds that value. So that for me is often very insightful as to why a client relationship might be failing.
Yeah, when we're talking about reports, Amy, it sounds like somebody needs to generate them, but it's not supposed to be a manual process, right? Maybe it should be an automated process, or maybe they just don't even know where to look for those reports to get them from the various softwares. And I could definitely see why that would be, something that you would be able to help with, kind of facilitate.
But it's also like contents of the report, right? So if you, I could talk about this a lot, you can probably tell, but like if you've got a table that's just, this week's data, last week's data, that's not maybe telling you anything. There are, I have worked in big corporations where they have to make millions a day to stay in liquidity. So obviously every morning the C-suite is looking for that table of how much money we made yesterday. That's really important. Like I won't like negate that. But what I mean is, if you just get a report full of figures, that's not necessarily helpful. For me, it's like, what's the change week on week? How does that account for seasonality? What was the change month on month? What was the change year on year? Like sometimes you'll see figures drop dramatically, say from December to January after Christmas rush, for example. So if the figures fall 40%, that's not really something to panic about. But if it's fallen 40% since last January, or if Saturday's fallen 40% since last Saturday, so it's all about the context of the data. And if someone's taking the time to make a report, they're not sending you just like a table of numbers. They should be giving you the change, and then they should be giving you the strategic summaries, like, this is what the data says, this is what we're going to take as an action. And maybe the result will be no action, everything's fine. Or maybe the result will be, oh, your payment gateway is broken and the algorithm's fallen off a cliff. That's one of the worst things I've ever had to deal with in my career. It's really important that you're not making reports and then not doing anything with them, right? The time that you're taking to make the report shouldn't just be you pumping out the numbers. It should actually be looking at the results yourself and having time to think about how they affect the business.
Well, that's a really interesting segue into what I wanted to talk about next. And that would be our cautionary tales. And so in our next episode, Amy, you and I are going to unpack a couple of cautionary tales. And so whenever I talk to somebody like yourself, with a very different kind of approach to business, it's always interesting to hear what those cautionary tales are. And you kind of told me that one of the ones we're going to get into is related to some inaction. And so this is maybe when a client doesn't do what you want or do what you say, and then they end up overthinking it. And so I'd love to hear more about that story. You also told me that there was another one where sometimes the founder focuses on the wrong things, and maybe that distraction or misalignment of priorities really kind of costs them a tremendous amount of time and energy. And so I'm really looking forward to getting into those. But before we dive into that, I do just kind of want to wrap up this session by reminding people that we're talking with Amy Wilson. She's a Fractional Chief Marketing Officer with over 10 years of experience leading performance marketing initiatives on a global scale. She often works with first-time founders brought in by investors, and she is sector agnostic, but has an immense knowledge base in FinTech, EdTech, and B2B sales. And so in today's case study, we did unpack a little bit of their issue, basically that their marketing team was not generating any reports. And so, from my perspective as the fractional CFO dealing with their finances, I needed to see some reports and I was not getting any. So I was a little bit put off. And so hopefully we'll get into some solutions in our third episode. But for now, just want to thank everybody for listening. And I hope you tune into our next episode, episode 2, where we go over some cautionary tales. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.